Parenting isn't a right, it's a privilege. But what happens when you can buy that privilege? Buy access to a child. Well, if you're in the US and have trouble conceiving, laws around surrogacy are pretty lax and largely unregulated, as long as you're straight and married, that is. Though there are some states that allow single parents and same-sex couples to conceive via surrogate, many don't. But in states like California, if you have the money for it, you can hire a surrogate. Plenty of celebrities have. And you might be thinking, what's the problem? The surrogates get paid for their work, the intended parents are happy. Isn't surrogacy and adoption a great equalizer in a way? And isn't it better than altruistic surrogacy or voluntary surrogacy, where the surrogate has to carry someone else's baby for 9 months and give birth with nothing in return except a pat on the back for a job well done? And though voluntary surrogates might be close friends and may even be family members of the intended parents and get to do that good deed and see the child grow up, don't they deserve monetary compensation? Doesn't only making altruistic surrogacy legal make it more likely that something shady might happen underneath the table? What's the difference between having a kid via paid surrogate or adopting a baby when at times you have to adopt the baby after their birth if the surrogate is unable to give up their parental rights before the child is born, especially in the specific case of genetic surrogates? Does surrogacy and, to an extent, adoption, specifically international adoption, mean you're basically buying a kid? In the end, does taking money out of the equation make surrogacy seem better or worse to you? And before I go further into this video, I think I need to address some things. Namely, I want to say that I'm aware of the politics and optics of this video. Anti-surrogacy and even anti-adoption debates have been used by the right to not only essentialize women's bodies and enforce the patriarchy, as in a woman's body is solely for procreation and creating life outside of a cis-het married relationship is unnatural and not God's way, etc., but also this rhetoric continues with the criminalization of trans and non-binary people, as well as gay and lesbian people, by basically saying that they shouldn't be parents because their identities threaten kids, which I find ironic considering how many straight couples are actually threats to kids. Additionally, there are trans exclusionary radical feminists or TERFs who claim to disavow the right, but still again ironically uphold biological essentialism and are anti-surrogacy because non-traditional families that include trans people as parents shouldn't be allowed to exist in their eyes, and surrogacy facilitates that outcome. So I want to say here that surrogacy and adoption are very sensitive topics, and I'm not here to shame anyone who has used a surrogate or who has adopted a child. I'm an adopted child. I don't believe only real mothers breastfeed or mothers are only cis women who give birth. I don't believe that the only parents that are legitimate are birth parents or biological parents. I don't think a woman's defining characteristic is if they're biologically capable to have children. That nonsense not only again hurts cis women with fertility issues as well as intersex individuals, but also trans women, trans men, and gender non-binary people who struggle to have kids and access that privilege of being a parent. I also know that there's a lot of negative stigma that surrounds the community of infertile couples and people who use other means to conceive, and I don't want to add to that. So I'm going to do my best in this video to discuss my views in the most sensitive manner that I can, and also be inclusive to the LGBTQ+ community that depends on other ways to parenthood than what cis-het society conveys as normal. But I'm not perfect, so please feel free to correct me down below. Conversely, you may not agree with my own opinions on surrogacy and adoption, and that's okay. I don't have all the answers to my own questions. And again, would love to hear what you have to say about these topics down below. These are just my views and opinions that are always changing as I gather new information. And too long didn't watch, spoilers, I'm not anti-surrogacy or anti-adoption, even though I know people who are. So in this video, we'll be diving into a very sensitive but equally very important topic, surrogacy, particularly celebrity surrogacy, as well as adoption and the intersection of class and gender, and how having a large family of biological children is becoming a marker of conspicuous consumption in an age where many people are struggling to even support themselves, let alone a family with children. So without further ado, let's go. Part 1. Parenting as a right. A phrase you hear a lot in parenting communities is that parenting is a privilege, not a right. And I agree partially with this phrasing, but at the same time, I feel like this quip doesn't encompass everything I'd like it to, and at the very least, is just too simplistic. So before we even begin to talk about surrogacy and adoption, and class, and gender and race, I think we should start at the very beginning. Do we even have the right to have children? The part of the phrase I understand and agree with is that parenting is a privilege. It's a privilege to raise a child and to be that trusted person for not only a little kid, but for all the phases. Newborn, baby, toddler, child, preteen, teen, and young adult. It's a privilege to witness that and be a part of someone's growing up. But it's the first part that gets to me. Parenting isn't a right, doesn't sit right with me, for a lack of a better word, because it feels like it's something someone very privileged would say, ironically enough. Parenting isn't a right is something someone who has no foreseeable issues with gaining that privilege, gaining that access to parenthood, might say. And I get that within the context of the phrase parenting isn't a right, it's a privilege, makes sense because parenting is something you have to earn. It's not a given and it can be taken away. You have to gain your child's respect and that right to be called a parent, to be called mom or dad. It's up to your child. And again, isn't everlasting or something you should ever take for granted. Rights are things we are entitled to as human beings, such as basic human rights, the right to life, our civil and political rights that are guaranteed to us not only as humans but under the law. Whereas privileges are usually taught as things that we earn and things that can be, again, taken away. Things in life that aren't a given. But that definition gets complicated when it comes to privileges that are unearned in society, such as privileges you're born with, which then ends up meaning you tend to have more rights than other people, or at least advantages within an unjust system, as we as humans are flawed and have created an unequal society. For example, if you're born cis, straight, white, wealthy, male, and aren't disabled, those are privileges that you didn't earn, but still grant you access to spaces, resources, and intangible benefits that others don't have, thus giving you more rights in the eyes of the law and the powers that be. You might be more believed than someone of another gender or race, for example, in the eyes of law enforcement, like the police, which are generally hostile and violent towards racial and gendered minorities as well as disabled people. When it comes to the privilege to have children, it's not an earned privilege, it's an unearned privilege. Whether you're born fertile or if you have fertility issues, it's not something that you really have any control over. In that way, being capable of bearing a biological child is an unearned privilege in that it's something that is determined by factors again outside of our control. Who gets to bear biological children is not up to us. So it's a privilege in that sense. So parenting isn't a right, it's a privilege in more ways than one. First off, it's an earned privilege in that it's a privilege to be called a parent by your own kid while you're raising them, as you don't have the right to control them, as they are independent, autonomous beings and are not obligated to respect you simply because you're their parent, especially if you're emotionally or physically abusive towards them. And secondly, it's an unearned privilege in that the ability to even become a biological parent, to have that chance to gain that privilege of parenting, is not up to you, but rather the luck of the draw. So in the end, shouldn't parenting be a right, either through surrogacy or adoption or through ART, assisted reproductive technology, as it's another inequality that shouldn't be faced by people who cannot help that they were born without that privilege. Many things that were once privileges, like the right to own land, vote, the right to have a credit card in your own name, and have an education, were things we have fought for. Why not fight for the right to be a biological parent? And the reality is that today parenting has become a right in that accessing ART, surrogacy, and even international and domestic adoption isn't too hard, especially if you're a cis, straight, married person and have money. Single people, unmarried couples, and trans and non-straight people, however, still face various barriers to entry in many states, not to mention the financial aspect of adoption and surrogacy, such as paperwork, traveling expenses, medical expenses, etc. And as one of my patrons pointed out, it's sometimes easier to adopt a child in another country than your own area code. Through my research, I found that sometimes it's cheaper and easier to hire a surrogate in another country with more relaxed surrogacy laws and then adopt that child into your country, specifically in Australia, where commercial surrogacy is banned. Travel expenses, medical expenses, and other reasonable expenses are paid for, but in places where for-profit surrogacy is illegal, the labor of carrying the child and the labor of the child at the end of the 9 months isn't compensated. One Australian noted that banning commercial surrogacy is a mixed blessing. Yes, it protects vulnerable women from exploitation in Australia, but wealthy couples can and do go overseas to countries such as India and Thailand, where even poorer women are at an even greater risk of exploitation. So essentially the problem gets moved elsewhere and the surrogates have even fewer protections. And less well-off couples are left with no options because adoption is virtually non-existent here, according to this user. And most people don't have an altruistic surrogate on hand. And I'd add that making commercial or for-profit surrogacy illegal just moves the whole thing underground, where for-profit surrogates in Australia do still exist, but have to do things under the table without labor protections, much like in many states in the US. And for-profit surrogacy begs the question, what are you paying for at the end of the day? And to a greater extent, when we receive compensation for our work, what are we paid for? Our time, the end product of our work? We'll get more into that later in the video, but for now I want to say that though only allowing altruistic surrogacy sounds good in theory, in reality it just makes the entire system more exploitative. Yes, money changing hands around a human life is kind of vulgar, but for the surrogate who has to do this incredibly hard job, shouldn't they get compensated in some way? Shouldn't the choice of being a voluntary surrogate or a commercial surrogate be the child bearer's choice? To not pay surrogates is like saying teachers don't deserve a higher salary because the job is its own reward, when no, that's not how life works. We live in a society, believe it or not, where money is kind of vital to survive. But getting back to becoming a biological parent as a right, I believe that everyone should have that opportunity to bear a biological child if they wish, and then that privilege of parenting can be taken away if you violate that trust as a parent. Conversely, people should have the right to abortion and the right to give their child up for adoption and to be a surrogate. But with these rights, we also have to ask, should people have the right to essentially sell babies and children, at least when it comes to international adoption and adoption in general, which at times leads to human trafficking? What happens when a surrogate parent, whether genetic or gestational, changes their mind? What about when class and racial hierarchies are involved? And these aren't hypothetical what-if situations as seen in The Handmaid's Tale, they're already part of human history. And though some may attribute this rise in surrogacy to technology and the global era of hyperconnectedness, aka global imperialism, as well as new ART like egg freezing, I'd say that these questions and practices have existed since humanity itself. Again, it's part of human history. Those who could not get pregnant and bear their own child for whatever reason turned to either surrogacy or adoption, which in the time of slavery was rape and forced birthing. One of the most famous stories being that of Hagar from the Bible. Sarah and Abraham could not have children, and Sarah was infertile. So Sarah gave Hagar, a woman they bought and enslaved, to her husband to rape and impregnate, and soon she was with child. Sarah was angry at Hagar because she conceived, even though that's what she wanted, or I guess what Abraham wanted, and then Sarah dealt harshly with her, and she, Hagar, ran away from Sarah. But the Lord came to Hagar and said, "Hagar, slave girl of Sarah," or Sarai, which was her name before it was changed later in the story, but "where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also told her, "I will greatly multiply your offspring so that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael." Hagar went back to her enslavers and weaned Ishmael, and Hagar bore Abram a son. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. And because of Abraham's piety to God, he was rewarded with a son born by Sarah later on, named Isaac. Sarah then forced Hagar out of the house with Ishmael, but both sons, Isaac and Ishmael, were said by God to have great nations named after them. When Hagar was cast out of the house, destitute and in the middle of the desert, thirsty and on the brink of death, God came to her and said, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift the boy up and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Essentially, everyone in the story is rewarded for being pious and following God's orders, even though it could be to their own detriment and abuse, at least when it comes to Hagar. When it comes to Abraham and Sarah, everything turned out great for them. But the lesson to Hagar, to the enslaved class of women, was to be obedient. Your time will come, you will be rewarded, and if not you, your offspring. And this story was later used as a catharsis to enslaved Africans in the US who looked to Christianity as their own native religions were forcefully taken from them. Christianity and its dogmas were forced onto the first enslaved people, and then later entwined and integrated with African enslaved culture as the enslaved population grew in the U.S. It should be noted that many traditions from West Africa remain mixed with Christianity and evolved over time. The story of Hagar in particular gave black enslaved women comfort in this idea that the suffering they were going through was meaningful somehow, and in order to help them make sense of the horrible circumstances they were living through. Not all enslaved black people took Christianity in this way, but it should be noted that Hagar is an important biblical figure to many black Americans, and the character is seen as a black woman to many, as her life was very much like that of enslaved black women in the U.S. Conversely, the story was appropriated by white people to justify slavery because slavery is the natural order of things, and in the end we'll all be rewarded, so things aren't that bad after all. And then, in 1985, this very real history was made into a dystopian novel for white women by Margaret Atwood, who prophesied the U.S. that would essentialize women's bodies so much that they'd become enslaved, without the hindsight that this already happened to black women, whose babies were stolen from them and who continued to be criminalized and killed by police. And though Dr. Anita L. Allen, professor of law and professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, notes, modern surrogacy, where there is consent between both parties, is not the same thing as racialized chattel slavery, it's hard not to see parallels, especially when it comes to the ownership of children and denying parental rights. Dr. Allen wrote 3 influential essays on surrogacy in the early 1990s. In the second one, Surrogacy, Slavery, and the Ownership of Life, she brings up the story of Polly, an enslaved woman who sued for her freedom and then wanted to buy her daughter, Lucy, but at first was denied. Lucy was not for sale. Lucy was legitimately owned by a Mr. Mitchell who wanted to keep Lucy to please his wife. Thus, Polly resorted to slave law to prove unlawful possession. By proving that she was not in fact a slave at the time of her daughter's birth, Polly was able to persuade the court that she was the rightful owner of her daughter. In the end, mother and daughter owned themselves, but the institution of slavery remained intact, and Mr. Mitchell was out the price of a housemaid. This story is a stark reminder that as a result of the American slave laws, all black mothers were de facto surrogates. Children born to slaves were owned by Master X or Mistress Y and could be sold at any time to another owner. Slave women gave birth to children with the understanding that those children would be owned by others. Not only that, but during slavery and Jim Crow, black women were obligated to raise the children that would one day rule over them. In her third surrogacy essay published in 1991, The Black Surrogate Mother, she recounts the story of Anna Johnson, a black surrogate mother who tried to sue for the right of the child she birthed, even though she had no genetic connections to her. She decided to keep the baby once the father and mother, of European and Filipino ancestry, showed how little they cared for Johnson, like not calling an ambulance for her when she felt labor pains, and not visiting in the hospital after she called herself a cab to get to the hospital in the first place. Dr. Allen writes, Anna Johnson testified at the October hearing that she did not initially plan to keep the child. Johnson said that she first changed her mind when Mark Calvert, the intended and biological father, refused to take her to the hospital. She was forced to take a cab for what proved to be false labor pains. While Johnson was a patient, Crispina Calvert, the intended biological mother, who worked at the same hospital, refused to visit her. In the end, however, the court ruled in favor of the genetic parents, the Calverts. Dr. Allen writes, the race issue, Anna Johnson's race, also made Judge Parslow's ultimate decision predictable. Throughout history, black women and mixed women have been hired or enslaved to play a number of important de facto mothering roles in American families. Moreover, black women who marry white men have sometimes wound up mothering white stepchildren. However, I suspect that few regard black women as the appropriate legal mothers of children who are not at least part black. Blacks are not supposed to have white children. Blacks are not supposed to want to have white children of their own, not in the adoption context, and therefore not in the surrogacy context. For better or for worse, race is a factor in adoption, and it will also be a factor in surrogate gestation. Racial bias in surrogacy is very real, and though this case is from 1990, racism along with classism hasn't gone away. Many white couples don't want to use a black surrogate because of this racist idea that their baby might be black, even if they're working with a gestational surrogate that has no genetic connection to the surrogate. And at the same time, black women are also seen as hyperfertile due to sexist and racist stereotypes, which makes them at times more sought after for another racist reason. Though a National Institute of Health survey conducted in 2009 found that black women had a significantly higher odd of ever having experienced infertility than white women, even after adjustment for socioeconomic position, marital status, and other risk factors for infertility, this disparity persisted. When seeking help with conceiving, black women have trouble finding surrogates because they're seen as difficult to work with or shouldn't have the ability to have a surrogate to begin with, or because being a surrogate for a black woman would be too political. Black women are also more likely to die in childbirth in the U.S. and are more likely to not be believed and helped by medical staff if they have labor complications, meaning that even black women who want to be surrogates have a hard time not only getting a match, but then risk their lives more than white women doing the same job. Earlier in 1986, there was the case of baby M, in which a white genetic surrogate, Mary Beth Whitehead, decided to keep her baby after giving birth and kidnapped the baby for 87 days before being brought to trial. In the end, even though she was the genetic mother to the baby, she lost custody as she did enter into an agreement previously to sell her child, genetic material, and labor for $10,000 plus other expenses at the time. The judge also thought that the Stearns, the couple in question, could give the child a better life financially, which brings class into the equation. According to the New York Times, The court gave custody to the Stearns, saying this was in the best interest of the child, even though they did invalidate the surrogacy contract as an affront to public policy and called the intended payment illegal, perhaps criminal, and potentially degrading to women. Should poor people have kids is a eugenicist question idiocracy asks and answers, but in reality is a very dangerous way of looking at the world, as is with race, like we discussed earlier. Being wealthy may seem like an earned privilege, but many times it's unearned and something you're just born into, aka generational wealth, and only a few throughout history have been able to accrue it based on various other unearned privileges. On a more recent and global scale, when it comes to adoption, the one-child policy in China as a way to control the population led to a rise in international and interracial adoptions in the 1990s. An estimated 160,000 to 200,000 international Chinese adoptees live around the world, me being one of them. And as someone who is a survivor of the one-child policy in China, which resulted in the human trafficking of babies and young children to foreign families, I know what adoption is like, specifically transracial adoption, and I know people who are adoptees who are staunchly against adoption and are anti-adoption, and I know people who are ambivalent towards it. I see many transracial adopted families growing up, some happy and some not, but I don't attribute the happiness factor to adoption, but rather to the adopted parents' disposition, how they were raised, their parents' own mental health, and to their financial position and privileges. We currently do live in a world where for-profit and voluntary gestational and genetic surrogacy exists, where international and domestic adoption exists, where we can use our bodies to host someone else's child to complete someone else's family, to help someone who has fertility issues, who might not be able to carry a child due to a disability, or for whatever other reason. And though we've discussed the historical, racial, and class implications of why that can be bad due to societal and serious medical biases, I also think that if we take away the right to someone's chance at becoming a biological parent, it wouldn't end well. Prohibition is never the answer. It just forces people to go through shadier channels and also further legitimizes this idea that some people should be sterilized, which has already happened in the US. The sterilization of undesirable populations, immigrants, people of color, poor people, unmarried mothers, the disabled, the mentally ill, was done via federally funded sterilization programs that took place in 32 states throughout the 20th century. Taking away surrogacy and adoption by surrogacy could be used to discriminate against people not only with infertility issues, but against gay and lesbian couples and trans couples who want to have biological children but can't carry their own biological child. And thus, by making sure that parenting stays a privilege for only some people, it ensures that only those already with privilege will reproduce, meaning white, cis-het, wealthy, non-disabled people, and thus deny the access of having a family to people who the capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy deem unworthy or without a right to life, which is extremely dangerous. Saying parenting isn't a right only makes sense in a world solely filled with cis-het people who have no fertility or financial issues, but our reality is much more diverse than that. Generally, I personally think international adoption and surrogacy needs to be better regulated, along with massive overhauls to the for-profit system, as well as making birth control and access to abortion safe and destigmatized. It shouldn't be easier for someone to adopt a child overseas or hire a surrogate overseas than within their own state, thus risking child and human trafficking of people and infants in historically exploited areas of the world and across states with completely different views on surrogacy. Additionally, there should be federal surrogacy protections in the U.S., not just state regulations for the safety of the surrogates and the future children. At the same time, I do think that for-profit and voluntary surrogacy should be available, as people should have both options if they choose to become a surrogate, and these contracts should be enforced, especially if there's payment involved. The New Jersey Supreme Court in the case of Baby M ruled that payment for the child and labor was an affront to women, but then where does that leave the surrogate? Without a paycheck for all the work she did, the IVF treatments, the gestation, the birth, and of course the baby, the Stearns said they cared so much about. You can't put a price on a human life, but you can put a price on the surrogate's time, work, and commitment, and the loss of this child she bore, and the effect it has on her body and mind. Though I do want to be careful to say that there's some miraculous bond between fetus and carrier, as that's essentialized to say that abortion is murder, but carrying a baby, feeling the kicks, not being able to sleep at night, morning sickness, milk coming in, getting swollen, is an experience that bonds the two beings, and there is a loss, like a physical loss of mass from your body. It might not be holy and sacred, but it is something that's traumatic. Birth is traumatic, and not even to be monetarily compensated for that is not okay. When it comes to medical medical insurance, what is considered infertility and what surrogacy costs and postpartum costs are up to each state's insurance providers, and insurance providers complying with state rules. According to Creative Family Connections, the pregnancy medical bills are covered by your surrogate's insurance. Your newborn medical bills are covered by your own insurance as the legal parent. All major medical insurance policies will cover a typical pregnancy. However, some providers exclude surrogate pregnancies explicitly in their full terms of coverage document. Additionally, most insurance does cover infertility, but to the extent at which they do cover that varies again by state and by provider. But honestly, the real solution here is to have universal health care covered by the government that also covers infertility and surrogacy care and surrogates, whose job isn't done after giving birth and just up to 6 or 8 weeks of postpartum care, but also includes at least 6 months of aftercare. And I'm a huge proponent for federally paid parental leave for all parents that lasts more than, again, 6 or 8 weeks, as well as free childcare. At the same time, I do understand fears of having the government sponsor surrogacy programs. At the same time, should for-profit companies have a hand in this? Should it be up to individual agreements between parties? Should it be only on a voluntary basis? Should surrogacy only be optional for medical reasons and not social reasons like it exists today? I don't feel like we should put such high restrictions on who can have a child by surrogate, but rather make it more accessible to people, especially those who are more challenged than others when it comes to conception, considering that these fees can range up to more than $100,000 if you go on this surrogacy path. And by making it more accessible, specifically to disabled people and people in the LGBTQ plus community, it will become more egalitarian and hopefully not as exploited by the wealthy. But at the same time, how can we make it more accessible if it should be an expensive service to compensate surrogates properly? Surrogacy, at least in the US, again, is up to or more than $100,000. And I understand why, and though voluntary surrogacy does exist, it's also harder to come by because you just kind of have to be lucky enough to know someone close to you willing to do that for you, someone that you trust. Who is going to pay for surrogacy is something we all want an answer to in order to make it more egalitarian and safer and protected, but I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I'm just one person, and I don't know if we'll ever reach a consensus on this because it's been a millennia and we still don't have one, but I think we should at least try as a country to make some regulations. Voluntary surrogacy should be an option for those who want to do a charitable act, especially if it's a close friend or family member and you don't want money to be involved outside of clinical and medical expenses, but that should be your choice. And though it seems as though voluntary surrogacy would be safer and more humane, I actually think it's more likely to lead to exploitation and also drives more people to do things that are unsafe and, again, exploitative just behind closed doors and across borders. There are plenty of states in the US right now that have unregulated surrogacy laws, or no laws, I guess, because it's unregulated, and that's terrifying to me. Lastly, to make surrogacy truly safe and accessible for everyone involved, we really need to protect minorities, especially when it comes to the medical field and medical racism, as well as LGBTQ plus rights and medical biases they might face. Without the civil protections for LGBTQ plus folks, Black and other racial minorities, and children who don't ask to come into this world, surrogacy and adoption will continue to be something that is discriminatory and that favors wealthy, cis-het, married Christian couples. To end this section on a bit of a high note, I wanted to highlight an article I came across about Zara Hilliard, a Black surrogate who helped a gay couple complete their family and only had positive things to say of her experiences. Caring for 2 fathers was also important for Hilliard. As a member of the LGBTQ plus community herself, she could relate to the dad's desire to have a child. People don't understand how hard it is for people who are part of the LGBT community to have a baby, Hilliard said. The process of that costs quite a bit. Hilliard explained that even with 2 women, it may take a while for one person to get pregnant. So when I met the dads, I understood how they wanted to have a baby for a very long time. They just didn't have the means to become pregnant right away. I could totally relate to that, she explains. In addition to helping other parents, Hilliard also wants to encourage other women of color and Black women particularly to consider surrogacy. It's important that I'm starting to speak to young African American women and let them know that this is something that you can do. Hilliard says, I don't want them to feel like they're not included when we're speaking to women about becoming surrogates. This is something beautiful, and it's also for them. That's of course just one person's experience, but I think it's important to highlight there are positive experiences out there and that surrogacy is not like this back alley, horrible, nightmarish situation. But that doesn't mean there should be no regulations or that nothing needs to currently change. So with all that said, let's get to the next section. Part 2, buying babies and kids as clout. So we just discussed at length that it is the right for everyone to have a chance to raise a biological child or risk furthering eugenics in a way that restricts biological children to only a certain race, creed, financial strata, marital status, etc. And I personally don't think it's helpful to put an asterisk here and say, well, not everyone should have that right. Not for people with a criminal record, for example, because criminalization and who's seen as a criminal in the eyes of the law disproportionately affects black people who have already been forcibly sterilized for decades for being seen as less than degenerates and evil by the government. At the end of the day, we don't know what bad, evil people look like just by looking at them. A lot of abusers of children are good at hiding that they're abusive. No matter how many background checks you do before an adoption or surrogacy, you never know what people are capable of, which is terrifying not only for adopted kids and surrogates working for the intended parents, but for biological children conceived and raised without such interventions. At the same time, I'm not sure how we can control crimes before they happen, before the babies and children come into existence. And I'm personally not for controlling who can reproduce and who can't, but rather a supporter of family planning, contraception, and legalized abortion. Not to mention, sometimes you seem like a stable person to the governing authorities and adoption and surrogacy agencies. You seem like a good intended parent, but then after having the child or adopting them, you realize it's not for you. And kids are returned to adoption and foster agencies or given up for adoption, but when it comes to international adoption, that's kind of hard to do. And it's especially hard to keep doing wellness checks on internationally adopted children or children born from a surrogate in another country and then adopted into the intended parent's country. How do you keep up those ties? And what about non-surrogate and non-adopted kids? What about biological families that never get checked on except maybe at school, if they even go to school? One factor that seems to take precedence over everything else when it comes to finding good intended parents for adopted or surrogate children is that they will be able to give the best life possible to these kids financially, which makes sense. Money matters, but also simply being financially stable at the time of background checks and visitations doesn't mean that it will last forever, and more importantly, doesn't mean parents are good people just because they have money. Money doesn't equal morality. This theme can be seen in Little Fires Everywhere, and I won't spoil it here, but there's a heavy focus on what's right for the child. We can give them a better life than you, biological parent, so therefore we have more right to the child. And that doesn't sit right with me. It feels coercive and makes low-income women of color want to give up their children to white families because they're told it's what's best, but it turns into a shame game, shaming the biological mother for being unfit and a degenerate for things outside of her control. In general, instead of policing the adults on who can conceive or not, there needs to be more government intervention when protecting children and infants and toddlers and teenagers to make sure they're okay after they're born, as well as financial support and child care for parents. An end to the wage gap and family planning and legalized abortion so kids are not brought into this world unwanted. Unfortunately, under the current political administration in the US, that seems to be more preoccupied with hypothetical children than the ones already here. They don't seem too concerned over children's well-being and have even started to dismantle the Department of Education at a federal level, the only free childcare open to all in the US. There's more and more conservative fear-mongering about public schools, and many conservative alt-right parents are taking their children out of school and homeschooling them. So there is no way to make sure that kids are okay. No other trusted adults in their life, and that's honestly so scary. So many kids come into this world and are raised by adults who have no regard for them as individuals and are at the mercy of their parents' whims, and that's not how they should be raised, away from society and community and differing and diverse worldviews and lifestyles. And it terrifies me that that's what's happening to so many kids today. I will say, if you have a history of being found to be abusive to children before your child is here as an intended parent, yeah, that's not good, and you should not be allowed to have children. or be allowed around children. But that really only comes into play for intended parents that are adopting or having a child via surrogate, not for biological parents that have no checks and balances because their reproduction is not monitored like it is for infertile couples or unmarried couples or single people who need to conceive through other channels, and that's again horrifying, and we need to change that. There should be wellness checks for all soon-to-be parents throughout the pregnancy and after. All kids, no matter how they're brought into this world, need connection to the outside world, to their communities, and need greater protections than what we currently have right now. But what happens when that right to become a biological parent also becomes a commodity? When a child becomes something you can buy, and not only can you buy the child, you can buy the entire pregnancy. You can pay someone to have your biological baby for you and then outsource your parenting duties to a series of nannies. Well, that seems to be preferential nowadays in the world of the rich and famous. Where once celebrity adoptions were the latest fad, it's now celebrity surrogacy. But wait a second, weren't you just talking about how great it is that this option is available to everyone? You want to take it away just because rich people have access to it? You must also want to force people to keep paying their student loan debt because rich kids can afford to pay it, so letting them off the hook would give them more free passes. And honestly, I don't care if forgiving student loan debt means rich people get off easy, or that giving universal healthcare means that rich people will have access to more free stuff. Likewise, I also don't think that the availability of surrogacy and the normalization of it is a bad thing simply because rich people are doing it and have access to it. On the other hand, I kind of do. At the very least, it's worth talking about and reflecting on. And I'm going to be honest here, my thoughts on this are really complicated and I don't have definite answers to all of the questions that I'm going to pose here, but this is something I think about a lot, even as someone who has never been a surrogate or used one, because I deeply care about workers and kids, especially as a kid who was abused and raised in a dysfunctional household. And I've been pregnant, I've been adopted, I grew up in a transracial family, and I know the history, class, and racial implications of surrogacy and adoption, which makes me skeptical of this new wave of celebrity surrogacy between cishet, non-disabled, and wealthy couples, famous or not, who go the path of surrogacy. Surrogacy, at least until the last 40 years or so, was seen as a last resort for couples desperate to have a biological child. It's very expensive and still is around 40 to 100k USD and wasn't very common, or at least in the public eye. There was a lot of unnecessary conservative stigma around it because you're not a real mom if you don't carry your own child, etc., which I don't agree with. And this stigma also extends to adopted parents, which really sucks and is extremely unfair. Additionally, there's the for-profit angle of paying a surrogate to do this work, which many look down on as dirty work, as if women shouldn't get paid to do something that's biologically innate, even if it's for someone else and they risk their lives doing it. And in the past, instead of going the surrogate route, many celebrities decided to adopt children internationally or domestically in order to show their charity and compassion, but also because perhaps they didn't want to be pregnant, and that's okay. Not every woman's biological destiny is to be pregnant and give birth. And I'm not going to pretend I can read these people's minds, but there wasn't this need to have their own biological children, at least right away, or this innate desire to be pregnant, so they just adopted or used a surrogate, and that's fine. Jamie Chung specifically used a surrogate because she was afraid she was going to lose work in Hollywood. You can't stop the grind, even if you're already rich. So hire a surrogate or adopt a child. It's that easy. You can see this is where I kind of get skeptical about this entire thing. And I'm not saying that these parents don't love their children, and I hate to say that they took the easy way out because that's rhetoric used by the right to hate on people who become parents in the non-traditional way, and I'm aware of that. But for the rich and famous and cis and straight enabled, it's kind of the easy way out, at least when it comes to having biological children. You can outsource all of the labor, all of the hardships of being pregnant to someone else in need of a big paycheck. Someone who will depend on you for their health and well-being for the next 9 months in postpartum care, but have very few national protections in case the whole thing falls through. People who have to have that physical loss of a child they grew for you for 9 months. But at least in celebrity situations, they get paid. That's the least they deserve. And the best case scenario is that they're loved and cared for and respected, but that's not always the case. Shauna, a surrogate in rural Pennsylvania, said that one of her clients, who she calls Catherine, was a wealthy woman in a cishet marriage, and that she suggested to bypass a surrogacy agency in order to save fees and just get their lawyers to draw up a contract. Catherine also was using a second surrogate without Shauna's knowledge, and when the second surrogate gave birth, she ghosted Shauna, only eventually paying her medical bills, as she had a miscarriage miscarriage with Catherine's fertilized egg. Catherine, who Shanna says was a famous person but changed her name again for this article, later went on TV and made disparaging comments about surrogates, including women who had miscarried her fertilized eggs. After all she's been through, it was too much, and Shanna broke into tears. It's been theorized on Reddit that Catherine could be Alexis Stewart, Martha Stewart's daughter. It took about 5 years and at least 4 failed surrogacy attempts before she had her first child around 2010. She talked about it on The View and also went through an agency in Manhattan. But there's no way to know for sure, but this is the reality of surrogates who work for the rich. And though there are studies that say that surrogates are mostly well-educated and well-off financially and go into surrogacy altruistically, according to this University of Murcia study from Spain that observed 231 surrogates in the US from 2024, and not because of coercion and economic factors, you don't necessarily know that about every single surrogate and what they go through to get this paycheck. And I do agree that many women who go into surrogacy do it for both altruistic and economic purposes. They're not mutually exclusive, but because they want to do something good for people, they are also easily bamboozled and exploited. There was recently a horrifying article from Reuters, it came out February 7th of this year, 2025, about a human trafficking ring in Georgia run by Chinese scammers and human traffickers that lured Thai women to the country under the pretense that they'd be surrogates for families who couldn't conceive on their own, but in reality they enslaved the women to harvest their eggs and sell them on the black market. The women went to Georgia to help families in need and also to earn money, as the job advertisement promised to be paid around 25,000 baht or $742 a month. One of the victims said that after agreeing to the job, she was brought to Georgia via Dubai and Armenia, where 2 Chinese nationals escorted her to a house. The women at the press conference said that they had feigned illness to appear weak to avoid having their eggs harvested. They also said that their passports had been taken and that they were told by their captors that they risked arrest in Thailand if they returned home. The Pavina Hongsakul Foundation for Children and Women, a Thai-based NGO which helped return the 3 women, said that it estimated around 100 more trafficked women remained in Georgia. The Chinese traffickers were using these women's eggs to sell around the world to various sperm and egg banks. Diana Thomas, CEO and founder of the World Egg and Sperm Bank in Arizona, has said that the market is filled with eggs illegally harvested from women in developing nations, adding that customers are often duped into believing that the eggs they're getting are ethically sourced. It's all a lie, she says. They're marketing to the Western market and show how to amend their profile to make them look like educated, white middle-class women so that people in the Western world don't feel guilty, getting eggs from poor, abused women who are not educated. Thomas has taken a very anti-human trafficking stance to ensure that her egg and sperm bank is a cut above the rest and is ethical, but we don't know anything for sure. Though we like to believe that everything is consensual and that surrogates and egg donors are all treated very well and happy and everyone's compensated, the entire process under capitalism is extremely exploitative and coercive. Even when women get into this profession for charity to help others, the fact that this is marketed as a self-sacrificing altruistic act makes them even more vulnerable, because if they do talk back or voice concerns, it's like, why don't you want to help me? So you don't want to be a good person? And that's really dangerous, especially when your health and future child's health is in the hands of someone who has so much more financial and therefore legal power over you. The power imbalance is so severe to me that it really makes me rethink if surrogacy should be accessible to people who don't already have some obstacle to carrying a biological child themselves. It's concerning to me that rich, cishet abled people want to, or at least have the ability to, outsource labor and birth because they don't want to miss a paycheck, even though, again, they're already rich, and at times hide behind this girl boss notion that they can have it all, even without making a single sacrifice. When that's not feminist, especially when you're exploiting someone, even if you pay them a large amount, that doesn't make it okay to then shame women for not getting their asses up and working. Have you seen Parasite? And maybe they don't want to deal with the mental and physical hardships of carrying a baby, especially in the public eye, which can be very unforgiving. Maybe they have a history with eating disorders, which makes the idea of pregnancy extremely daunting and scary, but then your solution to that is just hiring someone to do the work for you? Is that okay? I honestly don't have the answer to this, but it makes me uneasy to say the least. It makes me wonder how accessible this practice should be, as it's so inaccessible to those who may need it but can't afford it. Many single, unmarried people and non-straight and trans people just don't have 40 to 100K around to spend on a gestational surrogate, IVF, embryo, sperm, etc. It's disproportionately more available to wealthy cishet married couples who might not have any trouble conceiving otherwise, other than they just don't want to deal with pregnancy, and I don't know how I feel about that. And because there's no federal laws or even state regulations in many places about how much surrogates should be paid and what for, it makes the system ripe to be exploited. And I think that's because federal agencies and states are wary of putting prices on human lives and on pregnancy and future children that are essentially priceless. For-profit surrogacy agencies as well as nonprofits do exist to help mitigate the costs and communication between intended parents and surrogates, but not everyone goes through those channels because there's no legal incentive to in many places where the practice is again unregulated. But if we're going to be okay with gestational surrogacy, we need to put prices on these intangible, priceless things, as vulgar as that may be. We need to make sure it's accessible for people who have real issues with conceiving so it doesn't get overused and gatekept by cishet, abled, fertile, and rich people, and make sure that the surrogates are safe and get paid for their work. And I don't want to diminish the fact that, for example, Kim and Chloe have fertility issues, and women, no matter how famous, don't need to be open about their issues to the public. They don't owe us that. And you can easily find out who Kim's surrogate was on Google. It's not shrouded in secrecy. The information is out there. At the same time, I find it hard to take her too seriously because she and Chloe seem to lack so much self-awareness that they're out here thinking that they're self-made women who have it all, but only have it all because they have money and women who quite literally helped make their family as big as it is. Also, for celebrities who only use surrogates because they want to not be pregnant in the public eye, Kylie Jenner was able to hide her pregnancy and still be a multi-millionaire. If you don't want to be photographed or be pregnant and forward-facing as a famous, wealthy person, you can do that and still remain rich and influential. And maybe some rich women are just afraid of taking on the risks of pregnancy, so they want someone else to risk their lives for their kids, and honestly, maybe then you just shouldn't be a parent. Again, how accessible should this be? If you don't have the time to be pregnant because you might miss out on a movie or modeling opportunity or other social gig or financial gig where pregnant women aren't welcome, maybe you just don't have time to be a parent. And I'm sorry, I know that sounds harsh, but that's like the best case scenario for using a surrogate just because you want to. And this is just me coming in from the editing bay, and I know it's making me sound as if like rich women are just evil and, are so selfish that they don't want to give birth themselves or get pregnant themselves, but we are living in a world with billionaires, and no billionaire is ethical. They might be nice people, but how much are we going to coddle the rich? When is it too far to humanize these celebrities? Or even just rich, wealthy, multimillionaire and billionaires who aren't in the public eye? People who we don't even see because they're just that rich. The worst case scenario is using a social surrogate because you as a future parent just don't want to give anything up, and that you don't have to simply because you're rich and can afford it. Maybe you just don't want to be pregnant because it would mean making a sacrifice to your own lifestyle and you're not ready for that. Like not being able to go out at night with friends, or not being able to go to parties, or traveling, or staying thin. And then maybe, just maybe, you just don't have what it takes to make that sacrifice of being a parent. And I know that sounds mean again, but social surrogacy, like surrogacy just because you want to keep up your lifestyle, not deal with postpartum or pregnancy or weight gain or anything in life that's too hard, is ridiculous. I'm sorry. I'm not coddling rich people today. Just because you have money doesn't mean you should have 10 kids. I know that, there is pressure for women to have children, but that doesn't mean that you should give in to that. Maybe do some self-reflection before just thinking well, I'm rich, so I'm just gonna have kids even though I don't really want them. And again, I'm not saying that you don't want to have kids just because you used another way of conception, but I'm just afraid of the normalization and implications of this all when it comes to wealthy people. And I'm not aiming this at anyone in particular, like any famous person, but I am afraid of, again, the eventual rise of social surrogacy in wealthy circles. At the same time, I don't want to be misconstrued. I don't believe in equating carrying a baby and birthing one to being a real mom, because that's dangerous and essentializing to women. At the same time, if you are able to conceive and carry your own child and are financially well off, why don't you just do that? Why do you feel the need to put someone else through that just because you can't afford it? Because you want to keep someone else barefoot and pregnant to have as many kids as you want without having to actually sacrifice anything? And I don't think parenting is all about sacrifice, because that leads to resentment a lot of the time. Look at all the stuff I did for you, now you have to love me. But sacrificing and recentering your own world to be around that of your child is part of parenting, and it extends well past the birthing part of a child's journey. And these parents may be there for their kids growing up, but I don't know. I just don't think when you're someone who outsources birth and pregnancy to another person just because you want to, you're going to be the most present parent. I get that pregnancy is hard and horrible and scary. Postpartum is equally as awful, but should really wealthy people just get to opt out of that if they want to? And I know I'll get comments that are like, you're just jealous because you can't do that. And honestly, no, I'm glad I've had the unearned privilege of being able to carry and birth my own child. It's a human experience that I think many rich people are just too excited to pass off to others because they want to show off that they can still have a child-free life with children. Everything today just seems so transactional, as if exchanging money makes something okay and less morally dubious, when no, even though money does help to pay someone's bills and support themselves after an ordeal like surrogacy, doesn't mean that everything else goes away. But I guess we already live in a world where this is the reality. Lily Collins' husband says that they don't need to justify publicly why they use the surrogate, which is fine. They don't owe us that. They're allowed to be private people, but it makes me wonder, like, why is it a secret? And if surrogacy among the rich becomes so normalized, will it just be this new trend where only lower classes have to get pregnant and have to risk their lives carrying their own children as well as rich people's children? I don't know. I just don't like it. At the same time, I want to have more hope in humanity that people will never stop wanting to experience childbirth, but who knows where we're headed. I also want to say that I do understand the urge to have a biological child. I understand why gestational surrogacy is so important to people. As someone with a biological child, that was so important to me as someone who has no genetic ties at all with my birth family, and as someone who is a transplant in a continent that I was never really meant to grow up in. In the Stern and Whitehead case of Baby M, Mr. Stern was the sole survivor of a family who was wiped out during the Holocaust and World War II, which is why he wanted to extend his family line. It's something very primal, in a way, of wanting to continue our genetic heritage, so I do get it. What I don't get is, if you're already healthy and in a relationship and can conceive and birth a child, why not just do that? But I guess once you get to a point of wealth and status, any inconvenience that you can outsource, you outsource, even birthing your own child. Another more selfish reason parents want to have biological children and not adopted children is to have mini-me's. I mean, Cristiano Ronaldo's son Jr. was conceived via surrogate in the US, and we don't know who his mom is, and I don't know if he knows either. And that was before he got with his now girlfriend Georgina. Georgina only has 2 children biologically fathered by Ronaldo out of his 5 kids. Ronaldo by himself via surrogate not only had Junior but twins via surrogacy. And there is stigma against single fathers and single mothers for different reasons due to gender constructs, and I don't think it's helpful to judge him for fathering children with a surrogate because it adds to stigma to single fathers. At the same time, him in particular, like his entire being to me, is a red flag. I'm sorry. I feel like if Cristiano and Georgina and even the Kardashians were a family in the early 2000s, they'd have a horde of adopted children rather than surrogate children. I think another factor in this turn away from adoption is due to a global rise in conservatism, this need to continue your own bloodline, again, mini-me's, as well as keep generational wealth within biologically connected children. Similarly, how transracial adoption of the early 2000s was like this new age liberal thing in a way for white people to be like, we're all one race, humanity and family transcends race and borders and that kind of thing. Now in the 2020s, we're like, no, blood purity, go forth and multiply. To me, it makes it seem as though adopted and racially othered kids are like harder to love because they're not yours, so therefore you need a biological one because it's like fancier. We've really done a 180 turn from liberal post-racial America to 1930s Nazi Germany. Neither one is good, but I think I kind of liked it better when there was at least a facade of decency, but to be honest, that was pretty horrible too, so I guess we're just in hell now. Not to mention, there's this global decline in the birth rate, which is fine, but conservatives find it alarming because it means less nuclear families to support capitalism, and thus the wealthy and white billionaire class think that they specifically, having as many kids as possible, will save the human race. Elon Musk has like 11 kids, by the way, including a trans daughter who he openly hates. Donald Trump has 5 kids, one of whom he resents and barely acknowledges, and they're trying to persuade their followers to have more kids, even though, again, they're openly hostile to their own children and are passing laws that hurt children. But having a large genetically related family is now desirable, and this has been ushered in by conservatives and tradwives, large celebrity families, and just in general, aesthetic mom influencers who are wealthy, look great, and have tons of kids, usually around 3 or 4, is enough to be like, wow, that's a lot of kids. But some of these influencers have 5 to 8 to 12 kids. Why is this? Having a large family used to be laughed at or seen as weird, like on TLC's John and Kate Plus 8, and like 20 Kids and Counting. I don't remember the exact name of that show, but that show and family was fucked up. And I don't think the Goslings should be mocked or anything. Like, when you have kids via IVF, multiples are more than likely to happen, and that's fine. We shouldn't gawk at anyone's family size. However, the 18 Kids and Counting people kind of made it their whole brand and were purposely having as many kids as possible while also not being able to provide love, attention, and connection for all of them. Even Kate Gosling was outed as an abusive parent, unsurprisingly if you haven't watched the show, but also living under the camera didn't help anyone, especially the kids or the mom of 8 kids who had a lot on her shoulders and needed the money from the fame to support said kids. It's a whole thing. But today, again, having a large family of biological children is desirable because it's become unattainable for many Americans to even have one kid, hence the declining birth rate. Many young Americans can't even think of getting married or starting a family, let alone think about conception. Many can't even picture a future for themselves where they're not spending every waking moment working, worrying about how they'll feed and house themselves, let alone a family. People with master's degrees are working 2 jobs to afford a 1-bedroom apartment, and yet the rich, who are so disgustingly wealthy they even outsource pregnancy and birth, and who are just totally absent parents, wonder why people aren't having kids. Fuck off. The only way I can see people being able to even think of the future again is if we start redistributing the wealth and getting rid of the billionaire class who only wants to see us dead and replace us all with robots. People used to afford homes and a car on one income, afford out-of-state tuition for 2 kids in the 1970s, and now one person can't even afford a fucking 1-bedroom apartment after getting a master's degree, and that's not right. Wealthy celebrities and influencers and tech moguls parade around their kids as proof that they can have what the majority can't. A family, a home, and not just any family, a biological family with a gigantic mansion that they'll never be able to fill. They can afford 10 cars, and you can barely afford an Uber fare home, let alone an ambulance ride to the hospital. But there goes another tech billionaire politician on their private jet. Family and kids have now become commodities, more than they already were. Having the perfect family and perfect kids were always status symbols of prosperity, especially under capitalism, but with the rise of social media and family influencers and mom aesthetic lifestyles, the dial has been turned up to 11. And that, along with wealth disparity, has made kids even more of a status symbol than they, again, already were. Now you can show everyone you know and a wide audience of followers all of the toys and clothes and experiences and trips you can take your kids on that others can only dream of. And that's pretty dystopian. Does the rise in wealthy cishet couples using surrogacy mean that pregnancy will go away among that class? I don't think so. And I actually think that social media and brands and influencing will play a huge role as to why pregnancy will always continue to be so coveted under capitalism. It's just another aspect of life to commodify. Celebrities can show off to their followers and get free stuff from PR and do pregnancy photo shoots and 3D ultrasounds and baby showers, etc. and get all that clout of pregnancy, and owning your pregnancy makes money, so that will not go away. Not to mention, with the rise of conservatism and the essentialization of women's bodies means that it's probably more likely for women to remain in this "you must get pregnant to be a real woman" box for a very long time. So in this video, we talked about a very contentious but very important topic, surrogacy, and how it should be more regulated at a federal level because, as it stands in the US at least, each state has its own laws that some continue to discriminate against same-sex couples, as well as unmarried people, not to mention trans families and couples. And even worse, there's sometimes no regulations at even a state level on surrogacy, meaning no protections at all for the surrogates are in place. No legislation, and that means nothing can really be enforced or is looked at in any meaningful way in case someone is exploited within the state or across state lines. Surrogacy is real work that deserves compensation at the very least, and the surrogate should have the choice between altruistic surrogacy and for-profit surrogacy, but even under altruistic surrogacy, medical and travel expenses should be paid for. Even though it sounds good in theory to only have voluntary surrogacy, that altruism, someone's goodwill and willingness to help someone, can easily be taken advantage of. Not to mention the lack of available voluntary surrogates means that unregulated businesses will happen regardless, whether within the country or outside of it, where it's even harder to regulate. but greater protection for surrogates as well as the adopted and surrogate children, and children just in general at large, is. Family wellness check-ins with social workers for all kids should be available, whether there's red flags or not. Kids should know where to go if they don't feel safe, whether at school or at home, and the police aren't good for that, and unfortunately even CPS can't be very helpful when it comes to undocumented children and splitting families up and splitting siblings up. We need better family support and infrastructure, as well as family planning infrastructure, abortion, and easily accessible birth control options in order to make sure kids are coming into this world safely and wanted, and that when they're here, they remain so. As for wealthy surrogacy for rich people who are cis-het abled parents who just don't have time to be pregnant and don't want to give birth, I sadly think that it's becoming normalized to outsource all the work you don't want to do, as long as the people are paid, as long as you can afford it, even for kids. And maybe you can pay for pregnancy and a biological kid, but you will never be able to put a price on life. But when it comes to regulating surrogacy, we might have to in order to make sure that there are rates that are clear and open for all to see. How much is a child? How much is this child worth to you? I honestly really admire people who don't have kids, specifically cishet women, because there is such stigma if you go through life as a cishet woman without kids. I think it's really admirable to be a woman who puts your own life first and doesn't freeze your eggs to become a mom later in life possibly, or someone who decides to have kids later and then pass them off to caregivers and pay someone else to parent them just so you could fulfill like this social role that society and patriarchy has given to us. Seeing women who know that they just don't want to be a mom is honestly so refreshing and is needed in this very concerning moment in a time where conservatism and traditionalism is becoming more and more normalized and commodified. Before I end this video, I'll leave you with these questions. Would surrogacy exist without capitalism, without the commodification of bodies and children? Would we have a market of women looking to be surrogates without capitalism, without monetary compensation? Personally, I think there'll always be people willing to help others in need and people who are willing to do this act out of charity, but that's just me. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I don't have all the answers, and honestly, a lot of this stuff I'm still thinking about, and my ideas and thoughts and opinions aren't set in stone and are muddy and mixed, so I'd love to hear what you think about all of this down below. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.